Okay. And if you would just put any questions in the chat for our presenters. We are going to hear from Lynda Mercer, PhD, Radio I volunteer and outreach coordinator. We're going to hear from Chris Clements, MPA, Radio I board member and volunteer program coordinator with Louisville Metro. And then Rick Roderick, retired counselor and assistive technology specialist in blindness services for the Office of Voc Rehab in Louisville, and a Radio I outreach member. So I'm going to turn it over to that team to present. I'll turn my camera off and stop sharing. Okay. And then Lynda, I'm going to make you the presenter again. I'm going to turn my camera off and I'll mute and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Allie. I'm going to just pull up our presentation here. And let's see here. There we are. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here for our panel presentation. We're all affiliated with Radio I, and we're enthusiastic about what we have to say about the power of radio reading services. This panel presentation aims to begin an ongoing discourse about connectivity and empowerment, and the role of reading services in facilitating access and autonomy in aging populations. So we are comprised of 3 speakers, myself, Rick, and Chris. Each of us are going to be discussing components of the history and impact of reading services across the United States, also providing insights and research speaking to the role of radio reading services, just generally outside of just Kentucky, for meeting the needs of listeners beyond just simply supplying audio programming to the visually impaired. So Radio I of Kentucky is the primary case study for this presentation. We have 3 main objectives for this presentation. First, we're going to provide a comprehensive overview of the role of reading services in doing things like fostering community, generating civic participation, improving quality of life, and identifying and addressing unmet needs in aging populations. But we're also aiming this presentation toward facilitating effective communication and networking across organizations and institutions adjacent to radio reading services, and then others as well, so that we can more effectively begin to bridge gaps and generate greater understandings of the needs and available resources for different groups of aging populations in Kentucky and really in the United States. And then finally, this presentation hopes to point toward the future of resource planning, both for and with the elderly, with a focus on potential opportunities for expansion and transformation in the realm of reading services, and also other visually impaired services and other services even outside of those, as aging people across the globe themselves continue to adapt and innovate. So again, thank you for being here today. We have the 3 objectives here. I should have switched that slide, but basically we've got 3 main goals in this presentation, and we're going to begin with an overview from Chris Clements. So I'm going to turn that over to him, where he's going to talk about what Radio I is.
I think all of us are very passionate about because we all have a connection to Radio I in some form or another, and for us to be able to come together and share what I think is one of the best organizations in our state that does so much good in our community. It's so important. Many people may not realize that Radio I has been around for almost 35 years. It was founded in 1990, and later on Rick will give us a little more perspective about that. And it's a 24/7 reading service. But the Radio I mission is as follows. Radio I broadcasts a reading of current news, public services, and general interest programming to listeners and others who are blind and for printed disabled, with the vision of producing quality programming designed to help our listening audience lead enriched, productive, and independent lives. So the services and program, I think a lot of people don't realize that the programming and funding that we get doesn't really come from the government. It comes from a wide range of other entities out there. And you can see on this slide here, all the different variations it come from. It comes from corporations. It comes from cash donations from individuals. Many of them are volunteers or people that who are recipient of Radio I, also foundations. They can also come in form of in-kind donations, and then on-air sponsors. So here's a slide showcasing a lot of these funding sponsors that allow us to be able to do the radio service in our community. And with funding, you also have community partners. And many of the community partners, as you can see here, deal with library, media, and really higher educational institutions, as you can see with University of Kentucky here, Morehead State. All these are critical community partners that allow Radio I to do its service. So there's a wide range of different equipment that is used and is available for the radio service with Radio I. They can come in a variety of equipment forms, such as a subcarrier audio radios, which we use acronym of SCA. In addition to that, there are internet radios, Amazon Echoes, speaker telephones, and closed circuit networks. And many of these are used in like hospitals, retirement homes, nursing homes, and other variations of assisted living facilities, which are critical to older adults out there. In the broadcast area and accessibility, and as you can see that Radio I, and many of you may not know of it, and while we have a large presence in Louisville and Lexington, it is a statewide thing, and there are many different areas throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky where that impact is done, particularly in Eastern Kentucky, and you can see the usage is by SCA radios, toll-free listening, internet streaming. That is also done in both Lexington and Louisville, the two largest metropolitan areas in the state. And then down near the southern border, we have Morehead as well. And we are also making an impact in Western Kentucky, which at this time is only internet stream only. But you can see that all this is throughout the whole state of Kentucky. So here's kind of a guide of kind of what a Radio I day looks like. So this is like an example of a Monday situation here. We start bright and early at right at the wee hours of midnight there. And we'll have a show called Breathe or Breath. And then in different areas of the city or different areas of the state, different communities will have certain earmarked shows. Like in Lexington, they'll do a reading at 1 o'clock in the morning for Bourbon-Clark County news. In Louisville, they'll some of the suburban areas or suburban county areas will be a Henry County reading. East Kentucky will read a newspaper from the Manchester Enterprise. Morehead will read something from Ashland, and then Western Kentucky will read something from Henderson. All these different forms are different newspapers and periodicals that affect certain community where people who may be visually impaired or blind rely on that news and information for that. Later in the day, the shows will expand and more so. We'll have an Eyes on Success program. The larger newspapers will be read, like the Lexington Herald Leader, as well as the Louisville Courier Journal. And then we'll even read some additional national, regional, and other larger scale readings such as People Magazine, Time Magazine, Men's World, just to name a few of them. So you can see there's a different programming throughout the entire day. And this is just a snapshot of what a Monday reading program session would look like. So if somehow you missed that recording reading, there are sample podcasts and archiving programs. So you have a chance to see, or I mean, not hear, the recordings or readings from them later on in the day. And we have such a wide range of spectrum from older generations to younger generations on that scale. We'll read books in 30-minute installments. It could be a long story, a novel, or a bestseller, or it could be a short story. We have a partnership with AARP, so we'll read their weekly bulletin or their AARP publication they put out. And for children, we'll have a children's reading hour, and we'll read children's books for that. As I mentioned earlier, we mentioned People's Magazine and Time Magazine, but we'll also read large newspapers like the New York Times, and this is an archive broadcast as well. In addition to that, for our veterans and military folks out there, we have some military programming, so we'll read what's called a Veteran's Voice. And then for those that speak different languages out there, we even have some Spanish broadcasting programming, and we read the Spanish news and a lot of Spanish newspapers and other periodicals out there relate to that. And then we have things focused towards certain gender. We have the men's world and women's world. And if you have pets and love animals and stuff like that, we have a Pets Corner programming. And for your sports enthusiasts out there, we have sports headlines. And then we even have stuff that are earmarked for certain demographic people, like we have LGBTQ news related information. And then one that I actually enjoy doing, I read each week, is disability news. I'll read from a major periodical things like New Mobility, Disability Scoop, NCDJ, just to name a few of the many articles out there that are available through these resources and what's an hour-long program called Disability News. So what are the most popular broadcasts? This is based on a survey poll. The results that came out there. Our number one popular broadcast is the Lexington Herald Leader, because Radio I's main office is located in Lexington. So certainly a large congregated community is down in there and relies on that news each day. Followed second with the Louisville Courier-Journal. And then a variety of regional local newspapers, as we mentioned earlier, some of the county and surrounding townships that have their newspapers as well. Followed with fourth is sport news. And then in fifth place is both the Frankfurt State Journal and a various short story series are our 5 most popular broadcasts. And for the archive list, these are ones that people pull up and listen to at other times and stuff. Number 1 is National Geographic. Second is the New York Times. Third is Louisville's Business First, the Louisville newspaper that features on business stories that affect the Louisville community, followed by the Louisville Courier-Journal. And last but not least, in this top 5 is the Grocery Show, which is one of my favorite shows, which I get to do as a substitute reader time, which is where you get to share different advertisement ads that are going on at local stores or groceries in your community. These include Aldi's, Kroger's, Myers, among many others. A value market as such that are able to have their specials or coupon sales that are going on that week. You're the famous pick 5 for 5. So you know exactly what are the 5 that are available that week. So you know what deals you can get. Very informative and a very popular show that people really rely on, especially now as we live in an economic situation with high inflation. People need to know what the good deals are going on in local grocery stores. So here's some interesting stats I think that shows you the impact that Radio I does. And really going back to the theme of this conference about the mind, body, and soul. And I think all 3 of these affect with the community connectivity. When people are listening to Radio I and getting the information out of it, 83% of them feel less isolated. So they're not feeling lonely and they feel like they're being informed of what's going on. In addition to that, when they hear about information and news and community events going on, 16%, almost 1 in 5 of them now feel more comfortable about attending events, going in person, or learning more about them virtually because they're more informed about what's going on out there. In addition to that, 74% of them, almost 3 out of 4 individuals, will share the information and stories they got from Radio I with family and friends, in particular certain programs they really enjoy. And there's another high statistic, 82% of them feel more happier. Their soul is uplifted, they have a smile on their face, and they just feel so much more cheerful. Information engagement, another important component of Radio I services in our community. 84% of the people, majority of people, felt more informed about political candidates. And as we all know, coming up in May is a big primary race for governor, and then of course in the fall, November. So people know about what candidates are out there, what issues are out there. So they have a much more informative understanding of the content of that out there. In addition, with 87%, almost the same statistic here, they're more aware of local news and about community issues, about what's going on in their community and what's happening locally in their town or their city, just because of Radio I services. And 73% of them feel more informed about local services, like what events. Some of y'all might have just been on a few minutes ago about the farmers market sessions. They know about where the farmers markets are in our community or what community events are going on out there. So they're just much more informed about what's out there in their society. And a quality of life. The Radio I service that is given to them, 71% feel more connected with health issues, and they're more aware of it. As I mentioned earlier, I do read disability news, so I'm able to read articles and stories about Alzheimer's and dementia and many other medical and health concerns, and they just get a much more enlightening and understanding of these important medical and health things. And then they will then in turn, as it says, 14% of them here will then turn to their medical provider, a healthcare provider, their nurses, their practitioners, and share about what they had learned from those programmings with those health experts. Thankful for Radio I. So with all this background of the general information and kind of the important of what Radio I is about, Rick is going to be sharing with us about the history and the background of how Radio I came in existence and where all this was connected to people in the past. So Rick, take it away.
When we look at the problem of reading, things have changed so much over the years. back in the 1950s and 1960s, I relied on what I could get from the newspaper, which was just a little bit of it from human readers, primarily my mom. She would read Dear Abby or the comics, certain ones, and other articles that she might find of interest. But this was no substitute for reading the newspaper. I remember asking my Braille resource teacher, could there ever be a Braille newspaper? And she said, no, that's impossible, because it'd be cross prohibitive and they couldn't get it up that fast. Well, that's not quite true because there are now paperless Braille devices, but in those days, we didn't have anything like that. Then there were other means that came along. When I first came to Louisville, the library, the Talking Book Library, was producing tapes of the Courier Journal. So I would find out what was going on about a week later. Not really adequate. And I remember I borrowed this device called the Opticon. I could actually read print by little vibrating pens and moving a camera across the page, but it was extremely slow. And I remember reading a newspaper. And I was really excited to be doing that, except that I think I spent the whole evening reading one article. This didn't really work very well either. And then in 1970, I took a trip to Minnesota with my family. And there was a radio interview about a service called Radio Talking Book. And it used this subcarrier or part of a signal that most people can't get on a regular radio. And they used that for reading publications. And I thought, boy, this is really something. They read, newspapers and magazines and books, just like Chris was saying. And anyway, I remember being at the University of Illinois, and I was at a picnic and talked to somebody actually who was from Minnesota who'd volunteered for them and hearing about it. And then in 1974, the Kansas Audio Reader got started to do a similar thing in that part of the country. And others followed. There was one not too far from where I lived in Illinois at that point. But then I moved away and I moved here. And I remember asking, is there anything here? Is there anything in Louisville? Is there a radio reading service? And to my surprise, there was nothing. And I could get books from the library and magazines, but of course there was a time lag. However, this changed in 1980 when the Kentucky and a Radio Information Service, or CRIS, was established. However, it turned out to be unsustainable. They had to pay to use the subcarrier from the radio station. They had to pay to rent a phone line, to rent building space, and of course there were telephone charges because the line had to go from the building to the transmitter. And it was only on 4 to 5 hours a day. And what that meant was that no matter what time they carried anything, somebody was going to complain. Because it's not, I remember when they had the local news at 4:30, I was still coming home from work. How can I listen to that? And so after about 2.5 years, and when expenses caught up with them, grants were gone, whatever, the service ceased to exist. All hope was not lost, however. In 1990, Central Kentucky Radio Eye got started. Al Crabb, who was a retired University of Kentucky professor, started the service. I think his father was blind or legally blind, and he'd seen service in another state and said, we can do this here. Now, they were only on the subcarrier of WUKY in Lexington. But at that time, I had a very sensitive radio, and if I put the antenna just right, I could get the station. And I did. And it was just something to get, the New York Times and the New Yorker and various other publications. And it was on 24 hours a day and not just 4 or 5. Then conditions got worse. That radio no longer worked. I couldn't get it. But then in 2010, there was a special announcement. It was about a Radio Eye expansion. And this included Louisville, and there were it was really something. It was on a subcarrier radio, but it was also on the internet, and that actually provided a better signal, and I would listen that way. And that was 2010. And then in 2014, Eastern Kentucky was added to WEKU and its associated transmitters, and that was mainly served eastern and southeastern. And then in 2015, Moorhead was added, and that got northeast Kentucky. And that was provided through WMKY. Now, Western Kentucky is 2021, and it is not on the radio, but it is through the internet only at this point. But anyway, the service is basically available now all over the state and in some surrounding states. And on the internet, there are people actually listening all over the place. And Radio Eye has 2 studios, and one is in Lexington. That's the main studio, and they've actually moved. I think they're now in the Lexington Public Library. They were at the University of Kentucky originally. And then there's the second studio is in Louisville, and it is housed where I am right now, inside visually impaired preschool services. And we really appreciate them donating the space to us. Now, you may wonder, with all the changes, and newspapers are available online. There are telephone services for newspaper articles to read them in synthesized speech service. NFB Newsline does this. Why do we need radio reading services? What's the purpose? And actually, some of them have closed down. However, it's just the opposite in Kentucky. We are actually ahead of the game here. And there are some really good reasons to have radio reading services. One is the human voice. Some people really have trouble with synthesized speech, and the synthesizers don't have any emotion. So, they don't really get into the reading. And, sometimes a person can develop an attachment to a particular reader, even if we don't know them. You get used to somebody reading a particular thing at a particular time. And another reason is that some people are not technologically inclined. And although technology certainly has helped Radio Eye, it's also true that one can listen, and all that is really necessary is to turn it on. However, people who want more advanced access can get that by using what's called the Radio Eye podcast player, and can listen to things even if it's not on the time they want it to be on. And I've done this, and this, as Chris said, particularly with Business First, this is very useful, because Thursday noon, which is my lunchtime, and 5 is closer to dinner time. So, well, I just listen when I want to, and that's great. Anyway, that pretty much summarizes, or pretty much is what I am going to say, and I will turn it over to Lynda at this point.
Thank you, Rick. So I think we have a pretty good idea of what radio is, what radio reading services are. As Rick pointed out, in recent years, some radio reading services have actually dissolved. And so there's a unique quality to Radio I in Kentucky, but also those that are still standing, in that they were able to respond to COVID a little bit more readily, and Radio I certainly was. But a lot of the other reading services that are still standing are those that are a little bit more robust. So what we can really take away from the history of radio reading services and organizations, not just Radio I, but others like us, is that there's always going to be a need for information. And it's remarkable when you hear Rick talking about the timeline of radio reading services, is that in 1990, this is when suddenly it was really earth-shattering to be able to have access to the New York Times. So when we think about just the isolation, and I mean, and if one of the ways that I like to think of it as a researcher, a lot of my research is oriented toward disaster preparedness and crisis. So I don't like to overuse the term, but we are in an era where there are a lot of crises, and we're in an era where there's a lot of immediate information for a significant portion of the population, but not everyone. And the number of people who need information but cannot get to it is continuing to grow. So there will always be a need for information and reliable institutions. Reliable is a key word there, to gather and disseminate information to our most vulnerable and isolated populations. If we are in a crisis as a society, and we know that we're facing more crises ahead as we do, then perhaps one of the most powerful tools at our disposal is the very thing that services like Radio I offer, and that's information. So I really like to think about the idea that we can imagine information more broadly than we have. So just to give a quick definition of print disability, this is a person who cannot effectively read print. So this is not just visually impaired people. It's anyone who cannot effectively read print because of a visual, physical, perceptual, developmental, cognitive, or learning disability. So that, if you think about this encompasses a lot of people. Factors that could lead to someone being print disabled, maybe not from birth, but over time, a lot of people become print disabled as they age. Again, visual impairment is a big one, and your vision gets worse as you get older. Cataracts, macular degeneration, glaucoma, these are some of the top reasons why people become visually impaired. And this happens to a remarkably high number of people. Cataracts are the number one cause of blindness as people age. But we also have Parkinson's. Things like mobility issues, Parkinson's, mobility challenges, dementia is startlingly high amongst the elderly and is increasing. And we also have factors like low literacy or illiteracy, learning disabilities, and other conditions where you may not have a literacy issue, but you are not able to respond to print in the same way that you do to audio. So these are all ways that people could be print disabled, even if they don't have what we think of as a conventional or traditional disability. So if we think about aging and the relationship between print disability and aging, some of the statistics are pretty disturbing and really concerning, I guess I would say. More than 37 million Americans currently have diabetes, and most of those, about 90 to 95%, have type 2 diabetes. This is the 5th leading cause of blindness in adults. And Alzheimer's, this is the number that gets me. By 2050, about roughly 25 years from now, currently 6 million Americans have Alzheimer's. It will be 13 million, so it will more than double in 25 years. And what is just very alarming to me is that 1/3 of seniors will have some form of dementia before they die. And from the same Alzheimer's Association estimates that 40% of caregivers currently have a household income of $50,000 or less. So when we're thinking about resources, aging populations, and when we're thinking about print disability and access to information, we also have to include in these questions and concerns about vulnerability or access income, economic resources. 30% of our caregivers are age 65 or older. Some more statistics about aging. In just 7 years, 1 out of 5 Americans will be at retirement age. We are aging very quickly, and a large portion of our population is aging very quickly. I'm sure those of you who've attended other sessions have got a lot of statistics on this, and I'm sure a lot of you who are presenting and attending this session know a lot about this already and are familiar with it through your own work. And in just a few years, older adults will actually outnumber children for the first time in U.S. history. By 2060, we will have 2.5 working adults for every 1 retired adult. So this obviously points to the concern that we have now. It's already a crisis in caregiving, but it's going to be an extreme crisis if we don't respond. So some of the other aspects of this, and I use this term vulnerability, which I'll talk about in just a moment, but it's really more than just the sort of Webster's definition of vulnerability that we're used to using in everyday life. And again, some of you who are listening may be familiar with this already, but it's also about risk. Vulnerability is about risk. And there is an increased risk of persons with disabilities experiencing violence in the home and violence outside the home as well. It was about 50% higher risk for people with disabilities. This goes up 4 times higher for adults with mental health conditions. So again, print disability doesn't mean necessarily that there is a physical disability, but the numbers that we're looking at with aging populations in particular, having mobility issues, having some of these particular vulnerabilities means that there is going to be even more vulnerability and more risk of being susceptible to some of these concerns. Disproportionate rates of depression and anxiety. And this statistic is specific to people who are visually impaired. What I find really striking and again, concerning here is that suicide risk is higher amongst those whose vision decreases as they age. So it's easier to adapt. This is the sort of thesis, is that adaptation may come easier just in a general trend sort of way. If you've had a longer time without vision. But in older adults who are aging, facing some of these print disabilities, as they slowly lose their vision and degenerate visually, their risk of depression and anxiety goes up, but also their risk of suicide goes up. So this is why isolation is such an important factor in all of this. And information is what I would say is the antidote to some of these concerns about isolation and vulnerability. And then again, what I think is exceptionally concerning is the poverty line, where 25% of people with disabilities are below the poverty line. And this is double the national poverty rate, which is already high at around 12%. So you've got a lot of factors here that contribute to particular vulnerability in people who are disabled, and specifically those who are print disabled. And a lot of those people are going to be in the category of elderly populations. So when I say vulnerability, there's a lot of talk about vulnerability, and it means a lot of different things, really. So I'm using it in sort of the sociological context. And the research I've done on disasters and states of emergency in large populations talks about vulnerable populations, those who are typically in more marginalized communities, socioeconomically quite often, who, if there is, let's say, a hurricane, Hurricane Katrina is the best example of how to understand vulnerability, which again, you may very well understand and be used to this concept. But just to explain, the idea is that there are certain populations who, because they have fewer resources, fewer means, less access to information, less mobility, even if they do know about an impending crisis, they have a very real challenge, obstacles, and sometimes insurpassable obstacles to overcoming those challenges. So the crisis hits those groups of people harder, and they are less likely to recover from it, or less likely to recover as quickly. So it's about who's at risk of being the most affected and who's at risk of not being able to come back from a crisis. So I'm using this term loosely to think about print disability as an impending crisis, and one that's really already at hand. But also, I don't want to overstate it, but I do want to think about what we've all probably been familiar with, is that our aging populations are facing a lot more concerns about health and quality of life, and there are fewer caregivers with each passing day, fewer caregivers to provide care, and the economic conditions are becoming worse. So there is a matter at hand that we need to attend to. And so research talks about vulnerability and where isolation fits in. So these are things like no access or limited access to information and to other people. So isolation is a big part of this. The capacity to either send or receive messages, information, is somehow hampered. Or there may be difficulties with understanding content of the messages and assessing reliability. This could happen when information is presented in a way that is not tailored to the needs of particular groups. So obviously, when we have people who are print disabled, then that's going to mean that their information has to come to them in a very specific way. And oftentimes, again, with mobility issues, they cannot react adequately to crisis information due to some physical impairment, visual impairment obviously being a big one, but mobility issues as well. So that crisis information may be available, but the ability to act on it is another important piece. So when we think about really this as a matter of vulnerability and isolation, the question about response comes into play. So resiliency is really related to the ability to respond to information, which means in the way that I'm seeing this, information is powerful. Information is more powerful, and radio reading services are incredibly powerful when we think about the ability of information to access people who are otherwise isolated. So we can think about, for one thing, the fact that Radio Eye is local, but not just Radio Eye, radio reading services, the locality is a huge benefit. And we're in an era where global information, national news, these are all pretty accessible. Someone who is print disabled can turn on the news and listen to what's happening in Washington, D.C., New York City, but they can't always get the news, even in Louisville. But if you're in a very small town, if you're in Meade County, if you're in Pulaski County, if you're in Eastern Kentucky, it's going to be even harder to access the regional news, the local news. So what's happening there where you are is a lot harder to access. And this is one of the unique offerings the radio reading services, not just Radio Eye, but reading services have the ability to provide acutely local information. And one thing about Radio Eye that's also true of a lot of reading services is that they are usually very minimally staffed. So the overhead is usually pretty low once they get started. They're entirely staffed by volunteers, because if you're going to have 24/7 reading services, you have to have people willing to donate time. And that's what we have a lot of in radio reading services, is a lot of people who have resources. They have time. A lot of them are retirees. They have economic resources, and they also have care and concern. And they are here doing these things, reading the Meade County news, because they want to provide these resources to others. So the value of time should not be underestimated as one of the really interesting ways to access what I would say is sort of an opportunity to be maybe not a first responder. I don't want to misuse that term, but we think a lot about first responders when we think about crisis. And I like the idea of thinking about responsiveness of radio reading services in the big picture here when we think about vulnerability, isolation, and crisis. And with these small staffs, one of the really interesting things about having locality there and having, by Kentucky for Kentucky, by Minnesota for Minnesota, these smaller and more specific radio reading services, in some ways it's confusing. Even doing research, you've got lots of information in lots of different places, and a lot of it's not really that recent, so it's not really gathered under a large umbrella. But there's a really unique opportunity there to be acutely, specifically local, and there's power in that. And what disaster responders will tell you is that before you get FEMA on site, before you get federal funding, you've got the community there responding immediately. The people who care right outside your front door, those are the ones who are responding most effectively, most efficiently. And one of the most unique aspects of that is they know you and you know them. And this is one thing about radio reading services, being staffed by volunteers, having these materials read by volunteers who are local. You get to know them. And when you need information, you know who you're calling. You know the voices of the people who are speaking to you. So this really gives a community of people to others, to those who may not be able to access it. So I see this as an issue of resilience and response. And I think that Radio Eye is just one example of a really, is sort of a case study, and it does a nice job sort of providing some of these needs, but there's obviously more that can be done. So I think really it's just kind of like scratching the surface of the potential that we have with thinking of radio differently, thinking of information as power, as maybe one of the most important tools in accessing power, especially for people who are isolated and who are particularly vulnerable. So that's basically the end of what I have to say, and I can open it up now. We still have, I think, plenty of time if anyone has questions, comments, or if Chris or Rick would like to add anything.
I'll mute myself. Thank you. And I think you alluded there at the end, Lynda. I think, a lot of the staff is very short and not a lot of folks with Radio I services. A lot of it is relied on the volunteer support. And not only as a board member and volunteer myself, I have the opportunity of able to partner to help recruit older volunteers for the reading services that you do. And we have close to 10 to 12 different volunteers on a weekly basis that will read a wide range of materials for the programming in Louisville that is sent out all over. So if you know of people that want to volunteer and have a connection to someone that might have a visibility or a blindness, or even as she just alluded to, some of the other big concerns that are on the horizon, and the numbers are alarming, going up with dementia and Alzheimer's, they can provide this reading service of not only information and news, but also just community events going on and what's going on locally, but nationally and even globally, that is so essential for a population that needs it desperately and needs to be in the loop of things. So we're with the AmeriCorps program, RSVP, Retired Senior Volunteer Program. So we're always looking for people who are 55 and older to volunteer and help out with this reading service. So certainly if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to have you on board. And if it's not happening here locally in Louisville, there are other areas throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky that do have RSVP or older volunteers to help out with that. So thank you, Lynda, for making sure that people were aware that so much of the support really comes from volunteers for the reading service that we do.
Loose ends. One is the fact that, I think this has been mentioned before, but I want to emphasize Radio I is not a government agency, and I think this is an advantage, that we don't have a bureaucracy telling us what we can and cannot do, what we can and cannot present. Another aspect of Radio I is that we were able to keep going even during COVID. We did not shut down. We did not have to get material from elsewhere. Minnesota actually shut down. They were still going, but they were getting everything from Kansas. Another aspect that I'd like to mention, and this really follows on what Lynda was saying about other disabilities. There are people who maybe cannot move their hands and arms, whatever. They can no longer hold a book or a newspaper, but they can listen. And those people can still use something like the Amazon Echo and be able to say, open Radio I Live, play Louisville Stream, something like that, and issue commands to the Echo, the podcast player, whatever, just by using their voice. And that's all I'm going to say.
I want to throw a comment in here. Rita asked a question on the chat about the best way for seniors to access service who do not have access to the internet. And we do provide radios that are specially tuned to our subcarriers. So Western Kentucky does, because it's so diffuse. There's so many places that are hard to access, and we had trouble getting Western Kentucky to give us a subcarrier. But we have subcarriers everywhere else. So if someone needed to access Radio I services, we actually bring, Radio I sends a volunteer to bring either a specially tuned radio to their home or telephones. In case of people who don't have telephones, we can provide those. But you can dial in toll free to listen. So that's another aspect of the local piece here, is that going into people's homes when we're thinking about vulnerability, And just sort of piggybacking off your question, Rita, thinking about vulnerability and access, one of the things that I think about all the time is how difficult it would be for someone who is dependent on someone else, but who's also experiencing abuse in the home. And they may be dependent on the person who also has that power over them. And how would it be? How could they possibly get access to the outside world? How, if that is being, if that is a situation, and unfortunately we see that a lot in elderly and disabled populations. It's an alarming statistic. So one of the benefits of Radio Eye being local, and this is true of other reading services that provide specially tuned radios, and Radio Eye provides echoes, but again, without the internet, the radio can be brought in and just it's accessed just like old school radio. It's just on a subcarrier. So those are other ways that it's not like a social worker, obviously. It's not someone doing a wellness check, but there are pieces there that can help sort of fill in some of the gaps, because we also know that a lot of caseworkers have insane caseloads. So I see this as an opportunity for community building. And I like the idea of thinking of radio reading services as another piece in the bigger puzzle. And I'd like to see radio reading services across the United States grow and kind of expand in the scope. Again, thinking more broadly about information as a tool for empowerment for people who are in those vulnerable categories. Does anyone else have a question or comment or anything?
This is Allie. Erica put in the chat a really good question I'd like to get your opinion on. So she spoke a little bit about, some of these policies around accessibility for individuals with disability are becoming mandatory. But what is the most immediate need right now as far as advocacy for expanding beyond just the bare minimum? I take this question as, what do you all believe? What can we reach for with our advocacy groups locally to really expand offerings and go beyond just the bare minimum for our persons with disabilities? And for you all, it's going to be more specific to those with, that print disability, that visual print disability.
Well, I would try to speak to it, but I think really, to be honest, I don't have, the data on that is always changing. And that's one thing that I think radio reading services could improve on, is gathering information, because we're in people's homes every day. And it's an access point that should be a dialogue rather than a monologue to me. So I could turn it over to Rick if he has thoughts on that. But one thing I think immediately in terms of advocacy is having someone listen and creating a community where people, to me, it's the isolation piece, because there's just so many dominoes that fall immediately when you're isolated, and the economic, portion of that. I think they're economic or below the poverty line. There's an isolation aspect to that already, and disability contributes to that. So to me, it's a matter of being able to access community, being able to access care. But maybe Rick's got thoughts on that as well, as someone who has been living with visual impairment.
Well, there's always the thing of what are we? We've heard there are really two terms, and one is radio reading service, which is, mainly implies reading print publications, but sometimes Radio Eye has also carried some information shows that may, there was a program of technology news. Unfortunately, that radio reading service went out of existence, but that have provided it. But there are shows that can be provided in terms of just general information or information on particular topics that may not be from a print publication. The other thing that comes to mind, and we really have not done this, but I could see this in the future, would be to have some programs, maybe once a month or so, where people could call in and give their views about what they would like to see. The problem with surveys is getting enough people to return them. And how do we reach out and include more people? Because if we're not listener driven, we basically lose our reason for existence.
And some of the research I read talked about specific, just groups of people who utilize radio reading services, what they would like And one of the things that I read that I thought was kind of interesting was that a lot of people who utilize radio reading services want to feel included and want to feel as if they're not having things specially set aside for them, and that it's something more mainstream. And again, it just striking. And I've heard this presentation. We've talked through this presentation a couple times, but when Rick talks about 1980 is when you're getting access to information on tape. So all of the people who have any impairment that causes them to be print disabled, unable to access the information that so many of us take for granted every day. And until 1990, and really until the advent of the internet, that information wasn't available to a vast majority of those people, especially outside the United States, where infrastructure may be different. So I think thinking about the information piece and the inclusion piece, it's a word that gets used a lot, but to think differently, especially if our aging population, 1/3 of elderly adults will have dementia. And there will be a lot of people that we know, and perhaps we will be print disabled at some point in the future. So thinking about this now, and I'm really trying to wrap my brain around it, all of the gaps in what's already there. And it needs to be more normalized, but I think that goes without saying. Any other comments or questions? I don't want to take all the time.
Oh, you're good. So this is Allie again. I have a question, or really a statement. I really appreciate the use and description of print disabled. I think that is very eye-opening. I think when you get just like the short elevator speech of Radio I, and that it's reading publications and things, you think it's only meant for one group of people, but to hear print disabled and hear some descriptions of individuals that may benefit from it, and how it can really prevent isolation, I think the benefit goes far beyond what your initial thought process of Radio I is. So I appreciate that as someone who works with individuals with disabilities. I highlight your all's programs and your need for volunteers, and I'll continue to do that. So I definitely appreciate your presentation. I don't have any more questions in the chat. Again, if anyone would like to pop on and ask a question. But before anyone goes, just a reminder to fill out the post-session evaluation. You will get a link in your email. It will say OAC 2023 post-session evaluation link. If you would fill that out, your feedback is always important to us for continuing this conference. But again, still open for questions. We still have some time if anyone has anything.
Allie, I did see one question in there. Rita Wells had asked about how people could access services who may not have internet. So I don't know if we want to address that. And Lynda, I think you can certainly provide that, what Radio I can do for those individuals that may not have all the technology abilities to get Radio I services.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I'd seen the question, but mentioned that we can do the toll-free phones that we can install, and that there are people who can come out and install the SCA radios. So I think we covered that with her a few minutes ago. But also, I mean, we've got on the bibliography page of the PowerPoint, a list of resources. So if you'd like me to send that, I can, but also just radioi.org is the website for Radio I. And there are 4 of us who work at Radio I, but then there's 200 volunteers. So there's always someone who can help. And that's my job. But also there are a lot of people who really want to be involved in this work and get to know others. So please reach out, radioi.org.
I want to say one more thing. And we are really part of a whole bunch of services that I'm going to mention 2 other services that are available because I think we all complement each other. One is the Library of Congress program, www.loc.gov/NLS, National Library Service, what that stands for. And that will tell about the availability of talking books and magazines. There also is Braille, but probably more of the people who are aging would be more interested in the audiobooks. And there is really quite a collection there. The other thing that people should know about is NFB Newsline, and it is sponsored by the National Federation of the Blind and they provide newspapers and magazines, but it is a phone system and it's a synthesized voice, and you can go from article to article, and they have some other things that I won't go into with all that with the technology, but that is also another thing that people should know about. And by the way, one of the options, if you call Newsline through a local number, but the toll-free number, you can get the Radio Eye feed on that. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, and thank you for reminding me. I pulled up the resource list, which those are included on. So if anyone's still viewing the screen share that I've got here, both of those are on there. So thank you, though. There are some good resources. Again, it's really interesting researching this and finding the information is scattered, but it's all there. And I think it's really an interesting way to think about it as a sort of a need, but also an opportunity. It's very localized, but I think there's power in that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So we've got just a few minutes left, so time to move into our next entertainment session, which I believe is the comedian. So that's really interesting. So if you all want to check that out, thank you, Lynda and Rick and Chris, for your information, and just everyone for participating. I thought this was a great and informative session. So thank you all again. I'll let everyone leave the room, and I'll go ahead and end the recording, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allie. Thank you, everybody.
All right, I have stopped recording.